What is a digital twin?
Okay, sure. Happy to talk about that. It's this super nascent concept that with the right amount of data, you could build a digital model of either a human or a hospital or entire system, and then you could run tests against it to see how they would perform under certain scenarios. And when I wrote the piece, I remember there was an article on this show called The Good Doctor, where it's very Hollywood. It's this VR heart software where these two surgeons are standing in the operating room and this heart is beating in front of them. And then they're like, okay, what if we did this? No, the patient dies. What if we did this? Okay, they live. And so they go through all these different scenarios, and it's going to be this very complicated surgery. And they started to reduce the amount of risk by having a fully digital model of what that patient's or heart anatomy would look like. And that's basically the concept of digital twins, is that you could do something like that in the future. It could be reduce the amount of people that participate in clinical trials if we looked at past registrants and their data with their electronic health records to create various, I don't want to say digital again, but digital patients that exist in a database that then you could try things again. They're doing for it in oncology and cardiac care and chronic disease management.
You think about simulation centers give some of that opportunity to test, say, workflows within the hospital, to iterate, apply some of the design thinking mindset to the unknown of we're doing something that's never done before. We're introducing change into the system. And with digital twin, it sounds like you're able to test, but not in an environment where you're actually putting the patient's life at risk, but you're getting to a safer outcome by being able to do some of this fail fast, succeed sooner methodology. Hey everyone, this is Ty Hagler with the medDesign podcast, where we talk to inspiring medical innovators to help you find inspiration and knowledge about how to succeed in healthcare innovation. So today I'm really excited. We're going to talk to Katie McMillan. She is the founder of Well-Made Health, which is a business strategy and communications consulting firm. Katie loves to help early stage health tech companies to be able to grow by identifying market opportunities, incorporate research-backed content for users, and to leverage smart communication methods to be able to tell brand stories. Katie is also an avid writer. She's got some really well-researched and thoughtful articles, particularly some of her work for Chime, which is the Digital Health Insights column that she publishes weekly, which focuses on digital health evidence, healthcare innovation, and women's health. She has a wonderful perspective on how strategic research and planning can help women's health startups succeed that any medical innovator will find informative. So I've certainly had a lot of fun talking to her, and I look forward to sharing this with you. Katie, thank you so much for joining me on the medDesign podcast.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I've just been so impressed with your writing and your thinking. And as you and I have been getting to know each other, you told me a story about a Grand Rounds presentation you gave at Duke 7 years ago. I think that'd be a fun way to maybe introduce the audience to who you are and maybe some of the predictions you gave at that point, because I think you talked about some of the gaps in the care for OBGYN providers, and you had sent out a vision. Do you mind sharing some of that story, and maybe has any of that vision come to pass?
Yeah, I have equal amounts of interest and inspiration in both digital health and women's health, and I've worked in my career in both of those spaces. And so at that time, I was working at Duke University Health System and our innovation team, and was starting to learn more about this kind of emerging area, which people were calling FemTech at the time, which is like new technology utilized to enable improved health for women. At the time, as somebody that was thinking about getting pregnant and was in my reproductive years, I started learning about it from a personal interest standpoint, and then got my boss to approve me to take a month to do an essential, huge market research project to look at what was happening across various subclinical areas within obstetrics and gynecology. And then I presented my findings to the entire department of over 150 OBGYNs while I was 6 months pregnant. So it wasn't even the littlest bit intimidating, but
at that point, man, you were an expert too.
Yeah, I actually saw some of my doctors in the audience, and I was like, "This is so weird." It was great. It opened the door for a lot of fun conversations actually during my visits. The biggest feedback that I got from that was like, and the point of it was essentially your patients are going to start coming to you with these consumer tech products that they are hearing about on Instagram or via their friends or in magazines. And you need to be prepared for these conversations and you need to be aware of them. And you need to know what works and what doesn't work. And the cacophony of feedback was like, how do we know what works? This is still really early stage. And I feel like it was a completely valid question. And it's an area that I've tried to address throughout my career ever since then, pretty much. And I've done that in a variety of ways, from trying to build up a database. I do a lot of writing. And so I've written various articles that have done deep dives into things like perimenopause hormone tests or pelvic floor, at-home pelvic floor therapy, fertility trackers, etc. Just one of the things I like to do is find out answers to questions that people have and then share that knowledge with the rest of the world and hope that it does something.
And so you set out this vision that there are all these consumer tech products that will be coming into the market. And then it sounds like that's continued to bear fruit, where it's not like we've
Yes.
slowed down on, I don't know, maybe low clearance data feeds. A good way to put that.
I would just say there's thousands of companies out there
Mhm.
now valued at a combined billions of dollars, I think over $100 billion at this point. Yeah, a lot has happened.
Yeah. And do you feel like there's been a heuristic or a shortcut that's been developed other than the great insightful writing that you've been doing and reviews on this? Do you feel like the providers and OBGYNs have built a kind of a better sense of like which of those to trust, or is it still more of a Wild West?
I'll say yes and no. I think one of the things that I love to do is dig into PubMed and look at the peer-reviewed journals. And so when I
Mhm.
hear about new technology or people ask me about certain things, that's the
Really?
first thing that I go to see on the website of that company. Do they have any studies that they've published? And some of them could be in early days, you don't really have the ability to run a large clinical trial, but they may have done some early stage publications on that are white papers or things like that. And that's a good starting point. If I can't find anything there, then I go to peer-reviewed journals and see if I can find something there. But I do know that clinicians with their 15-minute time slot with a patient do not have time to run all of those research things. And that is one of my goals maybe for this year, is to actually build that giant database that has the products and has links to the peer reviewed journals and the research, and then maybe assigning some sort of quality score for it. So it's an easy, glanceable thing for both clinicians to make decisions about things to recommend to their patients, or if patients come to them to say, yes, this is validated, or no, it's not. And for consumers to make better choices about how to spend their money when it comes to their healthcare. But there are some other organizations. So one is called the Digital Medicine Society. They have just recently put together what they're calling the DIME Seal, which organization software companies can submit an application for them to review to say, does it meet certain standards for patient engagement, security, clinical validation, science, et cetera. And then Peterson Health Technology Institute is also doing something similar. They're looking at it more from the payer side of things, as far as does it improve clinical outcomes and save money. And so they've done some initial reports just around diabetes and hypertension. And so they do more like slices of things. But neither of them have really tackled women's health.
Thank you for those resources. We'll make sure we link to them in the show notes. So I'm going to bring up something, we haven't talked about this, but as you were sharing kind of consumer data feeds, the Owlet infant monitor, I'm an early fan of it because I think I dug up maybe their 2009 business model canvas pitch when they were
Okay.
students forming it. And I think I've seen a lot of different groups use business model canvas. And I think they
Okay.
were one of the ones that most effectively used that tool to rapidly iterate on their business model. And of course, they've become one of the early entrants to kind of consumer tech and health monitoring for infants. I'm curious, you're just, and that's just me from like an innovation practitioner, like they understood the framework. I'm curious from
Hmm.
your perspective, like how you've seen, because they went down the consumer tech lane
Hmm.
first because they didn't want to go through FDA clearance, and then have had some hurdles as a consumer product now trying to break into more kind of a FDA approved device as well.
Hmm. I have some serious thoughts about it.
Okay, do you mind sharing those? Because I'm curious.
Yeah, yeah. They're not the first ones to go through the consumer and then have to backpedal and then decide to go down the med device side of things. I did an interview with the CEO of Bloom Life, which is an at-home contraction tracker, which they got shut down by the FDA, and then they had to come back and become an approved medical device. And that's available if anyone wants to read it. But yeah, I have a few friends that are pediatricians, and they personally do not love the Owlet because they think it's like a parent panic device. They said that newborn sleep for parents and children is already very fraught, and adding something else that the kid could potentially become irritated by or that is alerting the parents constantly on their phones doesn't necessarily help people. Like somehow the human race has marched on for millennia without this, and is it really necessary? I think Owlet has tried to do, and I'm going to be curious to see what the outcomes are of it, is to have it more be something that is prescribed by physicians, so it's not just accessible to any paranoid parent out there, but rather somebody that maybe you've got home from the NICU or your child has some sort of other medical complications that you're trying to actively monitor. And then in those situations, it may make sense. So I'll be curious to see what are the outcomes they're looking for. Are we averting crises here? Are we averting ER visits? But if it's just parents waking up in the middle of the night to make sure that their child is still asleep, there's other ways you can do that with just a regular baby monitor where you can hear whether or not they're awake.
Do you necessarily need another alarm or false positives that it would be alerting and adding to the anxiety of parents versus trying to offer more of a sense of calm? Right.
Yeah. And I'm like very interested in the quantified self thing. I've had Fitbits and Apple Watches. I have an Aura Ring now. I think it's interesting, but I think the question is always, what do you do with the data and what is the value of the data? Can you parse through the data personally and be able to make sense of it without going into a panic?
Yeah, which is where the whole regulatory side of this of, are you making recommendations with this? Kind of what kinds of analytics can you draw from this? And is it, based in clinical evidence? So we met at the FemTech event that UNC hosted.
Yes.
And yeah, that was really fun. It was a great event, kind of showcases some of the FemTech companies that are in the Triangle area. And one of the common areas we've learned is we both come at healthcare from a design thinking and entrepreneurship standpoint. You mentioned that you had been part of a early design thinking education program that you'd helped put together as part of some of your time at Duke. Is that right? Do you mind sharing some of that story?
Yeah, that was actually even my pre-Duke days. So after my master's program, which I graduated in 2003, I went to work for a software development company. And when I was there, I met a med student named John O'Donnell. I don't know if you've ever come across him, but he's also in that kind of med tech space in the Triangle. And at the time, he was just a first-year medical student and was interested in health tech. And so we got to know each other. And then I started sharing some concepts around design thinking that I was learning about at work. And he was like, we need to make this more broadly available to people that are coming up through healthcare education. I decided to teach a class for about 6 weeks after work. It was like 5 to 7. And we put out applications for it. And students you had to just be enrolled in a current either undergraduate or graduate program at one of the universities nearby. And so we got over 100 applications, I think, for 20 spots, which was crazy.
Wow.
And it ended up really awesome because we had industrial design students from NC State, we had nursing students, pharmacy students, public health students, business school students, and everyone got to pick a problem they wanted to work on for the course of the week. And so we'd spend the first half of the class kind of talking about the framework and where we were in it. And then they would apply those lessons to their project that they were working on. And at the end, everyone presented and we had a big pizza party. And we charged next to nothing for the class just to essentially cover the cost of the pizza. Not even our time. It was just like paid for pizza and some champagne at the end of it. And it was really enjoyable.
Cool. Do you know if any of those students, any of the projects went on to do anything, or more of the education opportunity?
So what's really wild is none of those projects really became anything. But over the last year, 3 of those students, like their work has come across my desk in a way that I was not anticipating. I did an article where I was actually talked with a professor at UNC that was writing these chatbots around reproductive health for women. And so I was looking at PubMed to see, okay, what are the different studies that have been done on how effective this is around increasing health literacy and whatnot. And this one author that I kept seeing over and over again was one of my students. And so that has become her area of study, has been like the use of technology to improve reproductive health education. And so she's done a lot of work on chatbots. And so that was really fun. And I was on another webinar and somebody was like, okay, it was about a new software company out there creating an AI tool to help providers quickly triage through their notes. And then they also had a patient portal piece to try to get information faster, I guess, about their healthcare conditions that was trustworthy. And they, had the CEO give most of the talk, and then they were like, okay, and now they introduced their chief medical officer to answer questions from the audience. And I was like, Mark, he was one of my students back in the day.
Oh, wow.
So now he's the chief medical officer of a healthcare AI company.
Incredible.
I was like, man, I really know how to pick them. These people have gotten to be more successful than I am. It's been really cool. I think that's one of the fun things about working with students is you never know what seeds you're going to plant and then see what comes out of them.
Yeah. It seems like the skill that you've also taught there is like helping them to then further navigate, because maybe necessarily the first output of that process versus the next sequential iteration of it, that is something that ends up somewhere unexpected, but prepares them to be better innovators when kind of lightning strikes and they have that big opportunity in front of them.
Yeah, I think so. I was an Odyssey of the Mind kid growing up, and are you familiar with it?
It was created by an industrial designer.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, my dad was a mechanical engineer and he was our coach. But I feel like just that teaching people creative problem solving skills, no matter where you access it during your life, whether or not it's when you're 7 years old or when you're 22 years old, it's just something that you can continually pull from for the rest of your life when you face different problems in your career.
Okay, Odyssey of the Mind, and then history is part of your background, and then Masters of Public Health, and you've woven together a really interesting story for how your career's developed. I've been fascinated getting to know your background. I guess just you recently wrote an article on some of your twists and turns and how you've come into digital health and technology. How do you see the forest through the trees, as you say?
Oh, such a reflective question. I think that my whole career, I've always approached things with an open mind and with questions. And when I was at Duke, a lot of people would come to my door and they would say, I want to solve this project or solve this problem with technology. And I would always say, tell me more about the problem first. And so then we would figure out what the scale of the problem was. Is it just a you problem? Is it a departmental wide problem? Is it a industry level problem? And then from understanding the scopes of problems, you can then size solutions appropriately and consider what the level of effort would be potentially for solutions. And so I think you and I are both big fans of starting small and trialing it and seeing if it works. And if it does, scaling that, or if it doesn't work, trying something else. And that has guided me from creating custom software for people where they would come in and say, I want to build this thing. And I would say, why do we need to build the thing? What are we trying to address? Who's going to use the thing? Why will they use the thing? Why is it better than what exists right now? And then doing that across every different clinical area. And now I do that with startups as well. And then I think the other thing that kind of draws on my history background is like, we would always look at historical events from a social, political, and economic standpoint. And we would say, like, how do all of these things come together that cause this event to happen? And I think the same thing is in healthcare. You look at the social, you look at patients and you look at doctors and you look at like, how is what you're proposing going to affect them? From a political standpoint, who needs to buy into it? Are you going to put something on nurses that they don't really have time to do, or they don't want to do, or they don't find value in it? Thinking how to garner that political support for things. And then the economic side of things is like, what is it going to cost? What does it cost not just from a money side of things, but from a resources and the time side of things as well. I hope that my college professors would be like, maybe it does make sense where she's ended up with her career. But I apply some of those things that I learned at a younger age to more real life work versus historical research that I used to do back when I was 22 and I thought I wanted to be an archaeologist. Then with the writing that I do that's looking at industry trends and industry discussions, I think those just research chops have carried me as well. Look at facts and data and make sense of it and what's a good source and what's not a good source, and help people make better decisions based upon that knowledge.
Imagine there's a rigor to studying history that just helps, because from an innovation context is having to supplant a previous solution to a persistent problem. And understanding that history, and it could be that we just discarded something 50 years ago
Mm-hmm.
that didn't fit the changing of times, but there was a political solution or a sociological solution that fit 50 years ago that could be
Mm-hmm.
cleaned and learned from, as we're now trying to not necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater every time we're trying to innovate, but having that historical context sometimes of what did work in a different context and pull from that. Right.
Yeah. Why are things the way that they are? And I remember when I was at Duke, this giant survey went out that was like, to everybody that works there, it was like, what are your pain points here? And I don't know how I got a copy of all the results, but I did. And I remember reading through them. And the one that really stood out to me was like how pediatric brain cancer patients would have to have their entire head shaved when they were having surgery. And for little girls, this was something that was like particularly jarring to them.
Hmm.
And the person was like, this is a problem when it makes little kids sad, and it makes my job harder to have to see them cry when they're bald. And that was one thing that jumped out at me. And I walked my way down to the department and I was like, can I talk to this person? And I was like, okay, what do you think would make this better? And she was like, if we could just have hair ties, then we could pull the hair back and keep it out of the sterile field before we did the surgery. And then we wouldn't have to have all these sad little kids anymore. And I was like, can someone just order them some hair ties? And so it was like such a simple solution, and getting to the reason why. It was like, hair can get in the sterile field. We don't want that to happen. And so, but nobody had put that on the list of things that they needed to pay for. So problem solved.
Yeah, but like you're like maximizing local optimizations, right? Make sure the sterile field stays clean, so therefore you
Mm-hmm.
eliminate all risk of that at the expense of the patient well-being.
Mm-hmm.
It's just what a great story. I hadn't heard that story before, but there's like simple interventions like that, taking a broader view. That's what a great story.
Yeah, but then they had to keep everyone from coming to take the hair ties anymore.
Oh,
They were like, people couldn't be like, oh, I forgot my hair tie. And you're like, no, these are for the pediatric patients. But I was like, this is outside of my purview. You guys figure out how many you need to buy to keep both your staff and your patients happy.
Right, exactly. Or just have enough hair ties so you take care of anybody that needs it in that environment.
Yes,
Seems like a solvable problem.
absolutely.
Yeah,
It's good when you have those sometimes.
exactly. You've mentioned some of your history background and then how that's informed some of your writing. You're such a strong writer and researcher. It seems like that early Grand Rounds presentation you gave and that research that you did, it seems like that was a launching point for you. I'm just curious, you've been staying on, as I see some of the articles that you write, seems like you're staying like on top of a lot of the trends in a very fast moving space, but particularly wearable technology, biomarkers. I guess there's like what you're working on now, or maybe what's capturing your attention these days. I'm just curious, what are you, I don't know, excited about? You mentioned the Aura Ring. What's capturing your attention?
Yeah, I started back in September writing a piece a week for Digital Health Insights, which is sponsored by Chime, which is a big digital health technology organization. And sometimes the clip can feel a little bit intimidating, but it does allow me the space to be able to think about big problems or big things that are happening in the industry. And I really enjoy that. And so, like for the biomarkers piece, even before I started writing for them, I did an initial piece that was like a market scan of who out there, what tech companies are building wearables specifically for women and what are they monitoring. And I realized that nobody had pulled together a list of that previously. That had said there's the Oura Ring and the Fitbit and the Apple Watch, and there's this new EV ring and the Ava bracelet and all these different things. And nobody had put together a compendium of these are the top players. This is how much money they have. This is what the devices are. This is the data they collect. And then this is the price points for all those things. So that was like phase one. And then my bigger question that started that research project was like, what's next? What do we not know about women's health that we could potentially garner from passive data collection in a way that doesn't require people to go to a lab or order tests at home, and what could we benefit from having 24/7 data collection from. And so then that piece sat in my brain, took up real estate in my brain for probably a good 6 months before I ended up writing the follow-up piece, which was like, what does it take to build new digital biomarkers? And that was one that came out on Digital Health Insights, and I was able to connect with a PhD level researcher at Duke who runs an entire lab that looked at that. And they work with industry to help figure out what different signals that they can collect and what this could look like in the future. And that was really fun to figure out that one of the foremost researchers in this area is actually in my backyard. And I actually emailed her last week because I was writing an article on digital twins.
So wait, what is a digital twin?
Okay, sure. Happy to talk about that. It's this super nascent concept that basically, with the right amount of data, you could build a digital model of either a human or a hospital or entire system, basically, and then you could run tests against it to see how they would perform under certain scenarios. And when I wrote the piece, I remember there was an article on this show called The Good Doctor, where it's very Hollywood. It's this VR heart software where these two surgeons are standing in the operating room and this heart is beating in front of them. And then they're like, okay, what if we did this? No, the patient dies. What if we did this? Okay, they live. And so they go through all these different scenarios, and it's going to be this very complicated surgery. And they started to reduce the amount of risk by having a fully digital model of what that patient's heart anatomy would look like. And that's basically the concept of digital twins, is that you could do something like that in the future. It could be reduce the amount of people that participate in clinical trials if we looked at past registrants and their data with their electronic health records to create various, I don't want to say digital again, but digital patients that exist in a database that then you could try things against. And like I said, it's a pretty new concept, but I thought it was like a really interesting one. And in that article, I looked at what they're doing for it in oncology and cardiac care and chronic disease management. So you can check it out if you're interested.
I will definitely check that out. In part, you think about like simulation centers give some of that opportunity to test, say, workflows within the hospital, to iterate, apply some of the design thinking mindset to the unknown of we're doing something that's never done before. We're introducing change into the system. And with digital twin, it sounds like you're able to test, but not in an environment where you're actually putting the patient's life at risk, but you're getting to a safer outcome by being able to do some of this fail fast, succeed sooner methodology, but in a digital context where you can learn from it and before you apply it in the real world.
Yeah. And I think some of the more rudimentary versions of this were happening during COVID as hospitals were trying to figure out what would happen if X number of patients got sick and they came into the hospital and what would that mean for their chain and all that kind of stuff. And it's just really cool. Another way that technology could help improve healthcare.
Yeah. It seems like you're venturing into the futurist kind of mode of starting to predict some of the future. Have you ever considered that moniker?
It's interesting. I haven't really thought about it. I would say 50% of my writing, I focus on something happening at the intersection of digital health and women's health, and the percent are things that are happening more at a macro level. And some of that is in the futuristic space. Right now, everyone's really interested in AI, and depending on the day, I feel differently about it. I tried to use a tool recently and gave it a fictional article concept to see, hey, write a blog post about this. This would be the introduction, 5 bullet points, give me the conclusion, and include all the sources that you would pull the data from. And it sent it back, and I was like, not bad, could use a little work. But then when I looked up each of the sources, they didn't exist. They were all hallucinations.
Yeah.
These people the researchers didn't exist. I spent probably way too much time going down this rabbit hole, but I looked at the journals. I looked at PubMed. I tried to find these people on their academic institutional websites, and none of it existed. And so that made me feel like really bummed out about it and whether or not consumers are ready to have access to this, because I was like, man, one sad college kid one day is going to be stressed at finals and is going to turn some paper in, and they're going to get totally slammed because they're going to have cited all of these resources that were never published. But then I read another piece this morning by Jen Goldsack on the World Economic Forum website, and it was not about how AI can be used in actual patient care, but what can we do further back in the process in public health standpoint, or to be disease averting, potentially using these AI models. And that gave me a little bit more hope. Some people are all in on it. This is the future. And I'm cautiously optimistic, but keeping some thoughts around it.
Yeah, social media did a lot of good for the world, that it wasn't just a straightforward all roses situation. AI is going to have similar pros and cons. The one that I ran into recently was if you do find a link from ChatGPT, it'll add a tracking cookie on the end. So if you then just put the link into the browser, it says, oh, this also came from ChatGPT that you used this link. I was like, oh, they're acting more like a search engine than before, of starting to track who's using these different links and whatnot. So they're definitely changing how it's being used and how the applications of it. But even if it's not hallucinating, it wants you to know that, hey, this link came from ChatGPT. So
that's interesting. Yeah, I did a piece. One of my first pieces for Digital Health Insights was around whether or not generative AI will help or hinder patient education. And the underlying point for that, essentially, after I did all the research to see like how, if you Google something, if you say, these are my symptoms, what do I have? You get an answer back. It's probably going to be the most common thing that can come up. And you always have to make sure that the sources that you're pulling from or that they're speaking to are reputable organizations. All those disclaimers. This is not a doctor. You have to talk to a real doctor.
Right.
And yes, it can be helpful to help people maybe step off the ledge in the middle of the night when they think, I might have a brain tumor, but you actually have a migraine. Right. Ultimately, see a doctor for some patient care.
Yes. So then as you're looking at the different sources that you're pulling from for looking for innovation in digital health, what are some of the media sources you turn to as you're reviewing and articles or books that you see coming down the pipe?
Digests that I get in my inbox that I feel are pretty trustworthy. And then those will sometimes spark ideas for concept pieces. I like Moby Health News. I think they're a pretty good reporting source. Brock Health, as far as digital health things go. I started getting the Crunchbase emails, and the CB Insights also is another one to get like some kind of macro level stuff. And then there's various like Substack people that I like to follow. Like Chrissy Farr has been a writer. She used to work for CNBC and covered digital health, and now she does her own things. But yeah, I feel like I follow also a lot of physicians and stuff on LinkedIn. And so I see what they're talking about or what they're writing about. And then sometimes I'll reach out to them for expert opinions for sources as well when I'm writing pieces.
Very good. If somebody wants to reach out to you, either for collaboration or input on where digital health is going for the future, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Probably email, katie@wellmadehealth.com, or they can find me on LinkedIn. I'm under Katie Donohue McMillan, kept my maiden name for SEO purposes. And my website, wellmadehealth.com.
Okay, very good. Katie, thank you so much for joining me today. I've learned a lot. We took it in some directions that I've found delightful. So thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, good. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Hey, thanks for watching. I've really had a lot of fun talking to Katie. Before you go, please make sure you hit the like button and comment on your favorite part of the episode. This really helps to grow the podcast as we try to bring you more stories of medical innovators. All right, thank you.